there is the song, Most Wonderful Time of the Year, and he says it's the most wonderful time of the year. And then he says, there will be scary ghost stories and songs of the glory of Christmases long, long ago. So it was, in fact, a Christmas tradition to tell scary stories. So we will be telling scary stories. And by we, I mean I. Oh, hello. Didn't see you there. I suppose it's day 13? Well, isn't that exciting? Let's read some scary stories. Scary stories to tell in the broad, burning sunlight for Christmas.
Disclaimer, you've never read any of these.
I've never read any of these. I read scary stories when I was younger, but I never read the Scary Stories books.
So this is not only just a Patrick reads, but this is also a Patrick kind of reacts.
I will attempt to keep my reaction muted.
Why?
Because I'm a professional. Scary stories to tell in the dark, collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz. The story is High Beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior at the high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away and used the car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now, she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck follow her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. I guess we're going in the same direction, she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed a car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto that road, so did the truck. I've got to get away from him, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on again, and off again. She drove even faster, but the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing, she wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later, he had them on again, and he left them on. At last, she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. "Call the police!" she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. "You don't want me," he said. "You want him." Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. Well, that's a delightful little story. It wasn't scary at all.
That's totally scary.
Is it?
Yeah.
I didn't find it to be that scary. I thought it was a cute story.
High beams?
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
It's a cute little story. Guy was just looking out for her.
Yeah, but it's terrifying to know that there was someone behind her car. She could have died. That's a Dateline waiting to happen, is what I'm saying.
I think we've both seen it.
That's a Dateline waiting to happen.
Don't make bad decisions. Check the back seat of your car when you get in. Otherwise, this scary story could happen to you. You'll end up dead. You'll wake up dead one day.
Like this.
Oh no! Oh my god, Ryan! Ryan!
What's another story I should read?
A haunted house.
Haunted House. It's her all-time favorite.
And it's not scary.
The other one wasn't scary either. The Haunted House. So this story is The Haunted House, which doesn't have a picture.
I wonder why.
One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house. Went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then, it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened up the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 closer and closer, step, step, and it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke quietly. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face, so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, if you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church. The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him on to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money, and where that haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. That's another delightful little story. That was really nice. I mean, it's sad, obviously.
That picture, though.
Yeah, the picture's probably the scariest part of that whole situation.
See if you can make that face.
No.
Why?
It requires me to have no eyeballs and flesh
He's
dripping.
just like-
The picture's quite scary.
Yeah.
Drawings by Stephen Gamel. Or Gamel.
Which apparently he doesn't do interviews.
That's probably for the best. It's always nice to have an air of mystery about you. Gotcha. More scary stories to tell in the dark. Collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz. Drawings by Stephen Gamel. The Bride. The minister's daughter had just gotten married. After the wedding ceremony, there was a great feast with music and dancing and contests and games, even old children's games. When they got to playing hide and seek, the bride decided to hide in her grandfather's trunk up in the attic. They'll never find me here, she thought. As she was climbing into the trunk, the lid came down and cracked her on the head, and she fell unconscious inside. The lid slammed shut and locked. No one will ever know how long she called for help, or how hard she struggled to free herself from that tomb. Everyone in the village searched for her, and they looked almost everywhere, but no one thought of looking in the trunk. After a week, her brand new bridegroom and all the others gave her up for lost. Years later, a maid went up into the attic looking for something she needed. Maybe it's in the trunk, she thought. She opened it and screamed. There lay the missing bride in her wedding dress, but by then, she was only a skeleton. Well, that's a sad one. But, you know, do dumb stuff, get dumb results. Is it play stupid games, win stupid prizes, something like that? Maybe. Oh, it's right towards the front. The wreck.
Which is actually Christmassy.
Oh, we'll just see about that. The wreck. Fred and Jeannie went to the same high school, but they met for the first time at the Christmas dance. Fred had come by himself, and so had Jeannie. Soon Fred decided that Jeannie was one of the nicest girls he had ever met. They danced together most of the evening. At 11 o'clock, Jeannie said, "I have to leave now. Can you give me a ride?" "Sure," he said. "I gotta go home too." "I accidentally drove my car into a tree on my way over here," Jeannie said. "I guess I wasn't paying attention." Fred drove her to the head of Brady Road. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know very well. "Why don't you drop me off here?" Jeannie said. "The road up ahead is in really bad condition. I can walk from here." Fred stopped the car and held out some tinsel. "Have some," he said. "I got it at the dance." "Thank you," she said. "I'll put it in my hair." And she did. "Would you like to go out sometime to a movie or something?" Fred asked. "That would be fun," Jeannie said. After Fred drove off, he realized that he did not know Jeannie's last name or her telephone number. "I'll go back," he thought. "Road can't be that bad." He drove slowly down Brady Road through a thick woods, but there wasn't a sign of Jeannie. As he came around a curve, he saw the wreckage of a car ahead. It had crashed into a tree and had caught fire. Smoke was still rising from it. As Fred made his way to the car, he could see someone trapped inside, crushed against the steering column. It was Jeannie. In her hair was the Christmas tinsel he had given her. That's a spooky one. That's nice. That's a spooky one. I like that one. Yeah, that's a good one. More tales to chill your bones. Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones, collected from folklore and retold by Alvin Schwartz. Drawings by Stephen Gamble. Are you ready? The red spot. How terrifying. While Ruth slept, a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for several minutes on her left cheek, then went on its way. "What is that red spot on my cheek?" she asked her mother the next morning. "Looks like a spider bite," her mother said. "It'll go away, just don't scratch it." Soon, the small red spot grew into a small red boil. "Look at it now," Ruth said. "It's getting bigger. It's sore." "That sometimes happens," her mother said. "It's coming to a head." In a few days, the boil was even larger. "Look at it now," Ruth said. "It hurts and it's ugly." "We'll have the doctor look at it," her mother said. "Maybe it's infected." But the doctor could not see Ruth until the next day. That night, Ruth took a hot bath. As she soaked herself, the boil burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek. That's pretty gross. Yeah, I suppose that's a little scary.
Since that I don't think it could actually happen, but I don't even want the...
It could happen to you. Ooh. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months, then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but it was boring. All day the two men tended their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning, on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night, they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They'd curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes, one of them would take the food they were eating, which they both were sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else!" Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the dog grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insect had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We have been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth, like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing, but when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun.
So we just finished all 3 books. From each book, which one was your favorite?
Oh, gosh, like,
So the first book,
what were the stories in this one? Haunted House and...
High Beams.
I probably liked High Beams more.
Okay.
Haunted House was a very good story, though. I'll say that. High Beams, it was a good misdirect, because you're obviously like, oh, the truck is doing something bad, and then he's like, no, I was actually saving your life. Whoa, High Beams, I see you. Don't do that. So it was a nice like misdirection there.
And the second one was The Wreck and The Bride.
The Wreck,
Okay.
for sure.
Why though? Like,
I liked the payoff, because he very specifically took a piece of tinsel and gave it to her, and she put it in her hair. And then when he saw her body, it had the tinsel that he gave her. So that was it was like an interesting, it was a payoff basically. I liked that.
and then the last book,
Scary Stories 3. Was this Harold?
Harold.
And the Red Spot? Harold was a bit spooky. The Red Spot was just gross. I didn't quite care for that. And also spiders. So I suppose Harold.
Okay, why?
It was, I mean, it took its time, but it kind of developed the concept of Harold, like, oh, he's grunting, and then he's growing larger, and then at a certain point he just kills somebody and skins them alive. Like, that's a thing to do, I guess.
So out of the 3 books, out of those stories you read, which one was your favorite out of all of them?
Again, probably The Wreck. I liked the...
And that's funny because it's the Christmas one. That's cute.
It is cute, actually.
Yeah, that was the first time you read any of those. So
Any of them.
do you believe the hype or anything?
Yes, but on the flip side of that, they're stories for children. For that, I would say they're quite good. Yeah.
Especially the illustrations.
The illustrations are fantastic. I mean...
What was your favorite one out of those 6?
Possibly Harold? Just because you could see the, like, kind of twisted, abused stance of him. Obviously, Haunted House was quite legendary. Yeah.
So that concludes our Patrick Reads. And if you like any of the stories he read, or if you'd like to see him read some more, let us know. Comment below.
Give us a like.
Yeah.
Subscribe.
Yeah. And
If you want to hear me read anything else, I'll consider it.
I think he should do it. He has a great voice. Anyways, thanks for watching, and tell your mother hello. Tell her. I'm telling you, she's waiting for it. I promise. I promise.